Hey, good morning, everybody. This is Nevin, the host of the Politically Homeless podcast. And with me is Alex Benesch of Candor Intelligence Network. Thank you for joining us, Alex. I appreciate it. How are we doing today?
Yeah, busy as usual. I think that's the same for you. Yeah, I mean, I'm always working on multiple things at the same time, and you're doing the same thing. I mean, you constantly have to shift back and forth, this project and that project, and trying to keep track of everything, I guess.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Well, today we're going to be talking about one of your books today concerning the variety of topics on the stage collapse of communism. Did you want to discuss your works and a little bit about what candor intelligence is and a little bit about your politics and your background, please?
All right, so it took me about, should I say, 14 years to get to that point where you're, really good about, stuff that it's already been covered. You understand the different empires and you understand the modern intelligence agencies. You understand the different ideologies, and you know the literature, right? You've selected or pre-selected, the best literature you could find in all these topics, and you read these things even multiple times, and you keep track of what you read, right? So this is like a very baseline scientific approach, same thing you would do in biology or chemistry or whatever. So it takes you 14 years to get to the point where you're really, really solid, really good at all these things, and at that point you can start going outside of the box, because you have to know the box before you can actually push the boundaries of what the box actually is. And you should expect that from any science, right? If it's chemistry, if it's astrophysics, there should be constant progress, and there should be a breakthrough every once in a while. Yeah, I was originally hyper focused, laser focused on the 20th century, right? Because that's when all the action happened, and that still, concerns us today. Um, yeah, when you talk about today's ideologies, and how an empire can shift its marketing, like Russia has done, right? First of all, it was all about czarist Russia. Then it was all about communism, the greatest thing ever. And then it's like this thing they're doing right now in Russia, where they look at what the population is thinking, and they calculate their propaganda according to what the people want, right? So some people, they still want, they still like the communist era, so they're giving into that a bit. And then some people, they like the old Russia with the czars, so they market that. And then some people want a veneer of democracy, so they do that as well. And so when you look at ideological groups in these empires today, they use a lot of historical arguments. That happens all the time, right? They say, today we need to do this because the past was such and such. And, when you're basing your entire worldview on that, when you view mechanisms through that lens, what causes what, when you base your entire strategy on that, when you're betting your life on that, sometimes, in certain regimes or whatever, when you bet your future on this kind of thinking, how competent are these historical arguments, right? Because everyone does that. The libertarians do that. Well, because the past was like this. That's why we have to do it like this, and we have zero government, absolutely no government at all. It's what some of these people say. And other people say it must be 100% government, because that's what history tells us. So eventually, I grew absolutely tired of this nonsense. And by that point, I mean, speaking 14 years of full time work and learning about this stuff, after 14 years, I knew all these ideologies, how they functioned, what their underlying promises are, how they function basically, and what they promise. And so I thought, well, they're all based on historical arguments. Are these historical arguments correct? So that's why I had to go way back into the past, just bypass the 20th century that I already knew, and look at the 1800s and look at the 1700s, and even going further into the past. And so I discovered a few things that were new to me, and I found scientific literature on all of this, but it was always just about aspects of it or parts of that. First, large empires in the past these large empires, they most likely had very large intelligence capabilities, right? Because you can't have a British Empire, you can't have a French Empire, all these colonies and run all this stuff without, significant intelligence capabilities. But there's no standard literature on that. There's a little bit of this, there's a little bit of that, but you ask a conventional historian, he will tell you there were no real intelligence agencies before the 20th century, and I think that's a wrong view. So
Absolutely.
if we try to reconstruct the past, especially the secret aspects of the past, it's difficult to do. You have to be really good at what you're doing, and you also have to accept the limitations of that, right? So you're reconstructing something with insufficient data. You don't have perfect files. You don't have people from back then that are still alive that you could ask, right? But if we know how modern intelligence services work, we can kind of guess how they worked back in those days. And there's a lot of historical record on, aristocratic families and this conflict and that conflict, and this group hated that group, and then this happened and that happened. So you have a lot of data, and most historical books, they omit the intelligence sphere of what they're looking at, because normal historians are not trained to understand intelligence. And so it's possible to do. You can do that. And so once I started doing that, I went through these historical periods again, especially the revolutions, the American one, the Russian one, the Chinese one, because out of these revolutions came the three superpowers that we know of today. And also, if you look at the last 300 years, that's when the big stuff happened, right? Modern science, a different model of imperialism, because back in, before modern science, every empire was very, very similar. They all functioned basically the same way. And so when it comes to communism, you can adopt the standard view of the communist revolution in Russia. And there's a lot of data on this that most people are not even aware of, right? So there's an interesting chapter. There's an interesting chapter in the book here. This is the latest of my books, and it's the staged fall of the USSR and its true relationship with China. The chapter is called "Watching Russia Burn to the Ground." So this is about the time of uncertainty in Russia, when it wasn't clear what Russia was going to be like, because the so-called whites, people from the old system, they wanted to have a white Russia in the future. And then you had the communists, the Reds, and they wanted communism. And so then the interesting question was, what did these other countries think, and how were they going to be involved? Because this is a very common thing in the modern era, of course. You're watching what these other countries are doing, and you may or may not get involved. And oftentimes political debates are about, should we get involved or not? Whether it's the Gulf War or it's, Ukraine, it's always a debate, should we get involved or not? And if you make the wrong choice, that's terrible. This can ultimately backfire. I think I saw a celebrity recently, I think was it Candace Owens, or some of these new right-wing people, who said something about intervening, or America intervening against Hitler in the Second World War. And there's this argument floating around that the United States should not have intervened for, reasons.
Those arguments have been around for a while, even during World War II, and Pat Buchanan had resurrected it too.
Yeah. So different people said the same thing, right? So, but if you know your stuff, if you know history, if you know how militaries think and how tyrannies are, you can make this thought experiment. Okay, so we don't have mathematics that we can apply here, like in physics, or we don't have chemistry lab experiments we can do. We have to do this in our minds on paper and run the scenario. What would have happened if the United States had not intervened? If Hitler had been militarily successful against the Russians, if there was no Lend-Lease program to give tanks and all that stuff to the Soviets. Imagine if Hitler had actually taken over large parts of Russia. That could have become a massive problem for the United States ultimately, right? And especially if you count in the natural resources that Russia had to offer and the attempts at making nuclear weapons, or the early stage attempts of making German nuclear weapons. So eventually you would have had a massive rocket program of the Germans. Maybe the Germans would have gotten intercontinental ballistic missiles first. Imagine that craziness, right? You have some Hitler type or Hitler's successor or whatever, and they would have, intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear warheads, right? I mean, this is a nightmare scenario, and we can actually do that, run that scenario in our minds, or we can do it on paper and say, not intervening, that's a silly idea. Sometimes you just have to intervene. And so with Russia and communism, that was the question at the time. So specifically in Britain and the United States. So World War I was over. Many people died. Lots of money was spent. And so then you have this communist problem brewing in Russia, right? And so the question was, what do we do as Britons? What do we do as Americans? Should we send a lot of troops to Russia to fight against the communists? But that would mean we would fight for these white Russians, meaning the old aristocracy in Russia, the regular Slavic type aristocracy. And you had public debates. You had some secret debates as well, obviously. And we have a lot of data on the public debates, right? So the argument was it's too expensive to intervene. We just spend all that money against the Germans. How can we spend even more money to get involved in Russia, which is a much bigger country, obviously? And so it's a money question. Then it's a political problem. How can we convince our people, our voters, to support another big war in a faraway country, right? How do we sell that? And then, of course, so many people had already died in World War I. How can we justify more dead people? And so we have a historical record, especially in Britain, of people saying, influential people saying, let Russia deal with itself. I think the specific term was, let them decide their own fate. Now, I, of course, chose a different title for my chapter. It's called Watching Russia Burn to the Ground, because that's what it was. I mean, it's easier in hindsight, to judge somebody else's decision in the past. But, this is just, this is in history and politics. You do revisit the past and you do come to different conclusions. So Churchill said, no, we should intervene. This was Winston Churchill. He said that we should strangle communism in the crib. We just destroy it when it's young. If we wait, it's going to become a much bigger problem. And ultimately, that turned out to be the correct assessment that Churchill gave at the time. And then Lord Milner, he was kind of all over the place on that topic. And so this was like a back and forth. And ultimately, no significant troops were sent to Russia, even though, and that's confirmed by the French at the time, you could have had great success in Russia against the communists. Because there were some battles over there, and with a substantial amount of weapons, or appropriate amount of weapons and support, you could gain lots of territory and squash communism. That was absolutely possible. And there were calculations, how many lives is this going to take? Now, the French were optimistic, and we have the historical record on that. There was a French assessment at the time, and they said that, well, it wouldn't be expensive to squash communism. We wouldn't need so much money in there. But the British were operating on a different assessment. And this was very pessimistic. They said that, the author said that, well, it's going to cost us a fortune. We cannot afford this. And it would take so many lives just to make some gains in Russia. So let's not do it. So completely different assessments. And so then it was out of the question to intervene in a military fashion. So what was left, the intelligence realm. Okay. So there was some British secret missions, especially the Riley mission. So this is when you send out agents and you make these spy networks in Russia and you try to kill Lenin and some of these other Bolsheviks. Okay, so this is baseline stuff, right? But according to regular historians, the British had just learned how to do it. They just improvised. The British improvised their intelligence services overnight, and they didn't really know what they were doing. but that's not really realistic. So they had these operations. They failed. So they didn't kill Lenin. They didn't destroy communism in the crib. And if you look at these secret operations, which I've done for my book here, Stage 4 of the USSR, it seems like these attempts by the British were not really serious either. So they made a decision not to really intervene in a military fashion. And it seems like they also decided to not intervene for real on the intelligence front. So there was probably, as we can reconstruct it, there was a conscious decision to let the communists win, because they knew at the time, the British especially, they knew at the time what was going to happen. The communists were in control of the Russian arms production. They could make their own rifles, they could make their own artillery shells, and so on. The so-called whites were dependent on shipments from outside. And so it was pretty clear where this conflict was going. So apparently the decision was made to let the communists win. So then we have to run different scenarios. Why would you let the communists win? What would be a reason for that? Or what was a basket of reasons to let the communists win? And I run these different scenarios in my book. I'm not saying I favor this one scenario because it makes me look cooler, or because I like it more, or because it's like gives me fuzzy feelings or whatever. No, I run these different scenarios because that's ultimately what you have to do. Whether it's a current intelligence case or it's a past case, you have to look at. Could be that way, could be that way, could be that way. And you have to have an open investigation in all these directions. You can eliminate some scenarios when they don't make sense or when you can really debunk them. So, for example, the baseline conspiracy narrative of the revolution. You know, that the windmills, I call them the windmills of Zion, you know, the elders of Zion, they did this communism thing. So the Russians are not to blame. This is kind of what people think these days, you know, that communism was forced onto Russia, as if the Russians didn't do this to themselves for the most part. I mean, these peasants in Russia, they signed contracts for the Red Army, and then they killed other Russians. And Lenin was a Russian. You know, he had a Jewish grandfather or whatever. That didn't matter. That didn't decide anything. And Trotsky was from a Jewish family, but he was still a Russian, and this was a very Russian affair. So you can exclude some of these stupid scenarios, and then you're left with the more realistic ones. So what would be a reason or a reasoning to let the communists win in Russia? So maybe they thought, well, communism is stupid. You know, you can't really have a functioning system with communism. So maybe if we let communism win in Russia, these people are going to be so slow and stupid and incompetent, they won't be a problem to us. It's just going to be 20, 30 years at least of smooth sailing, not having problems with the Russians. That's one idea, of course, you know, because if you think about it, before the communist revolution, Russia was in trouble. You know, the czars were just backwards. The regular aristocracy was very backwards. They did not have great industry like America. They were terrible. Russia was utterly terrible. And so there was always a danger of Russia falling apart, right? And Russia breaking apart, and then you have all these different Russias, and they're all fanatic and crazy, and they start wars. What about having a unified Russia that is stupid and incapable, right? They don't have great industry. Wouldn't that mean peace or relative peace or calm for these other countries like Britain and the United States? So they don't have to deal with it. That's one possibility. And then, of course, we saw pretty early on, after the communist revolution, we saw these economy deals, you know, like selling stuff to the communists, you know, whole factories, building up industries and that sort of stuff. So why did that happen? Well, maybe the thought was we can control what's going on over there by selling them stuff they can't make themselves, because it's like feeding a drug addict. You know, they need Western technology. They need that constant infusion of Western technology. And by giving them what they want, they're not developing their own capabilities, you know, and it's just like to this very day, the Russians, they can't really make things themselves so well. So maybe that was the decision, right? Let's imagine that for a second. This decision was made, let Russia burn to the ground, so it's not a problem for us. Let's hope this all works out. So then it didn't work out. Russia became a grave threat, and it became a nuclear threat. So we could say, looking back, that was the wrong decision. There should have been an intervention. Churchill was right, but some people made terrible decisions, and they overruled Churchill, and they made these decisions, and it turned out to be wrong, and now we have to deal with the consequences. So then we have to think, in that scenario, you have to think about who made these decisions back then in Britain. This is something that Professor Carroll Quigley was so concerned about when he wrote Tragedy and Hope, when he wrote this other book about the Anglo-American establishment. Many people mention, or some people mention Carroll Quigley, but they didn't really read his books, or not fully. And essentially, Professor Quigley was really concerned about that secret decision-making because he knew the appeasement against the Nazis, which was strategic, and this decision and that decision. These decisions were horrible. They backfired so bad, but who was making these decisions? Where's the accountability? How can we prevent further mistakes by these secret decision-making bodies? Because we saw a repetition of that, and that's what Quigley warned about. We saw this starting in 1991 when Soviet Union was supposedly over, and everybody had this wishful thinking, oh, we're going to deal with the Russians, it's going to work out fine, but it didn't. So who's making these secret decisions, and who is held accountable for that? So this is what I'm looking at in this book. And so then there's another scenario, right? Britain, especially powerful circles within Britain and powerful circles within the United States, they made a decision to work with the communists, to have a working relationship with them, to watch that, what they call social experiment over there. And they would hope that this would all work out, but then there was an infiltration problem because the communists were really good at spying. So once you have serious espionage infiltration against Britain and the United States, the communists may know a lot of our secrets. And we saw people like Lord Louis Mountbatten, and I talk about him in the book. We're talking about not just moles, your regular type communist mole. You're talking about a super mole or a hyper mole that can install other moles, that can influence policy and all that sort of stuff. So when you have that kind of an infiltration problem, what do you do? What decision do you make in secret? You choose to make a deal with the communists, maybe. You settle with them. You say, okay, here's the suggestion. Here's the deal. You shut up about our secrets, and there are many bad secrets that we have. You shut up about the secrets, and we sell you technology that you need. And so we can all be happy. You control this part of the world, and we control that part of the world. So that would be kind of a secret deal kept from the general population. Wouldn't that be significant to understand or to know about, if that actually happened? Because that would change our perception of history. And this is also something that Professor Quigley talked about. He was writing his grand book, Tragedy and Hope in the 60s, in the Cold War. And Quigley, who was really experienced with empires, quickly said, well, it seems kind of fake to him, right? Because with nuclear weapons, it doesn't really make sense for the United States to have all-out war with the Soviet Union. It's stupid, right? You destroyed too much. So he thought the Cold War was kind of fake. And his suggestion, this is right in the very end part of the book Tragedy and Hope, he said that, well, maybe it's kind of a semi-staged Cold War, where both sides grudgingly accept that you can have all-out war. It's not going to work. Let's just, go about your day. You just take it day by day, your imperialism or whatever, or your running your affairs, and you have a proxy war every now and then, like Korea or Vietnam, to scare everybody else. But overall, you would be left with a secret, grudgingly secret cartel type situation where there's just no alternative to this quasi-cartel. So that's another possibility that we seriously have to look into. Because if that was true, and this is just one option of many, if that was true, we would now have a situation where the superpowers could stage significant proxy wars to keep the overall system running. Everybody's scared. No regular country would misbehave after many people are dead, and it's all so awful, right? You would have running things smoothly for the next decades after, some proxy wars, right? And yeah, we have to consider these possibilities, unfortunately, because we know this from history when two armies meet on a field and then they start talking to each other and they say, well, can we make a deal? You get this, we get that, and if we come to an agreement, we can all go home. We don't have to murder each other. So same logic applies to empires, even the biggest empires in the world. And so then you go through the different scenarios. Okay, there was maybe a secret deal because of espionage, infiltration. The communists know our secrets, but they need our technology. And then there's also another scenario that I had to look at, which is the possibility that Western intelligence, especially aristocratic intelligence, older intelligence, that these guys actually controlled Bolshevism the whole time. Just for completion's sake, we have to look at that scenario as well, because there's a historical record of Lenin's right-hand man working for Tsarist intelligence. There's a good study by Edward Ellis Smith on the young Stalin, who was most likely working as an informant for Tsarist intelligence. We got the overall logic, especially the British imperialist logic of controlling communism at home and in other places. So, for example, when peasant serfdom ended, you needed a new system, with modern science, for new imperialism. What was the political landscape going to look like? You would have citizens that have much to lose from change. Those were the conservatives, or would be the conservatives, because they were privileged before. Then you get sort of the middle ground of society. They have stuff to lose and stuff to win, so they would be the political middle, the Enlightenment. And then you would have people in society that have nothing to lose. You could call them the left or whatever, the proletariat, or you can choose whatever term you want. So how do you work with a society like that? How do you control a society like that? Now, obviously, in Germany, they try to run a fake democracy. The German Empire from 1871. They try to have parliaments and political parties, but it was all very, very fake. They made left-wing parties illegal for a while. Then they made them sort of legal, but they tried to infiltrate them and run them. They tried. They may have failed. This may have gone off the rails, like in other places too, because every empire was faced with the same situation. How do we run a political system? How do we run, parliaments and political parties and ideologies? We should run it all in secret, right? I mean, this was especially the British approach, because in my view, the British faked their own enlightenment, because they had a transition from classic serfdom, imperialism, to this half democracy, half republic, half monarchy thing, but there was no revolutionary chaos in Britain like you saw in other places like France. So, judging from the historical record, trying to reconstruct what the intelligence capabilities back then were, it looks to me like Britain ran its own fake enlightenment, right? Secretly controlling capitalism, secretly controlling the political parties and controlling the ideologies using baseline intelligence methods. Because what's the most simple tool in the intelligence world toolbox? You create front organizations. This could be a corporation, this could be a political party, this could be anything, right? So maybe there was an attempt to, by British intelligence slash aristocratic intelligence, maybe there was the attempt to have a controlled left-wing, to have a controlled left-wing sphere domestically and internationally. Maybe they were really good at controlling it. Maybe they were not so good at it, and this went off the rails. and they had to settle with the communists in Russia. Maybe, this completely went off the rails. Maybe they were good at controlling them. And then, of course, we would have to look differently at the communist revolution in Russia. Because for the aristocracy, they always wanted to change Russia. The House of Hessen, which was the British throne and also the Russian throne, the House of Schleswig-Holstein, and all these funky German names that they had. They wanted to change Russia in the 1800s. They wanted to do this for a long time. I mean, we even see that when Vladimir Putin talks about this. He talks about history, and he talks about Catherine the Great, and he talks about Peter the Great. Well, what did Peter the Great try to do, and what did Catherine the Great try to do? They tried to westernize Russia. They ordered these aristocrats in Russia to shave off their beards and learn French and read Western literature and all that, and gain access to Western science and technology and culture. So they had these different ideas in their minds. One of the ideas was to have a fake enlightenment, like in Britain, and turn Russia into a half monarchy, half fake republic, right? Another idea was to sort of copy or make a version of the American system and have sort of like a full republic, but the Russians, they wanted to control every major aspect of it, obviously, but it would look like a republic, a full republic. Then you had an idea which was strange, but you can find this in a historical record. You had this idea of keeping the czars, keeping the czars, keeping the monarchy, but have socialism underneath it. Of course, controlled socialism, right? Because that way you could still have like the House of Hessen, the Romanovs, rule in Russia, but they could, get rid of these regular aristocrats, these Slavic aristocrats, just get rid of them in a fake, revolution or whatever. And then you have the czars, and they can control these collective, production facilities and farms and whatnot, and then say that this is a great new system, when in reality it's just another version of serfdom. You cannot really reinvent the wheel, right? So if you want a new version of serfdom, you can call it something else. And this is, I think, what some of these aristocratic families tried to do in Britain, and I think some powerful people in America tried to do this as well. They didn't like the idea of freedom. They didn't like the idea of a republic or a half republic. They wanted a new type of serfdom, total control, bureaucracy, but they needed to give it a new name. So when communism happened for people in Russia, this felt like serfdom. I mean, it was very, very similar to serfdom. You had to work these fields. You couldn't complain. You couldn't change the situation. You would just have to do this work and take orders. You would carry out all these orders all the time. So what was the big difference between a communist farmer and an old peasant farmer? It wasn't that big of a difference, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I'm looking at
Yeah,
these
this is
different.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking at these different scenarios in the book, and I'm getting the historical record straight, like in this chapter about the missing Romanovs, right? Because as we know, conventional view, the last Tsar was killed with his immediate family, and if you look into any history book, any regular history book, they will give you a detailed account of how they were murdered, in the basement and shot and who was yelling and blah, blah, blah. But, if you look at the source material, and if you look at meta studies that have been done on the source material, you will see that the source material on this is terrible. It's just objectively terrible because it comes from communist sources, it comes from unreliable sources, it's a bunch of hearsay. The physical evidence is terrible. And in the context of the time back then, it made sense for the communists to just it made a lot of sense for the communists to hold the Tsar and his immediate family and then sell him for ransom money under the condition that he just disappears from public view forever. This was preferable to the communists because they wanted to be seen as, and some people you could deal with, people you can make deals with. So it was the preferred option for the communists, and it was also a preferred option for the European empires and different aristocracies, because even the German Kaiser, um, the German Kaiser would have preferred that the Tsar disappears from public view, never to return into public view, but he didn't want the Tsar to be killed, because if the Tsar gets really killed, other aristocrats may get killed, like the Kaiser after World War One, right? The Brits, they could have taken in the Tsar, and there was some rumblings and musings. We should evacuate the Tsar and bring him to Britain, and then put him in a castle, and then the Tsar could theoretically run an exile government. Would be easy to do, right? But they ran these scenarios, and they apparently made the decision that's not what we want. So, according to the official record, nobody had a plan, nobody did anything, and then the Tsar was killed. But still, Britain was happy to deal with the Bolsheviks, which is kind of strange. So it makes a lot more sense that the Tsar was simply sold, and a few other Romanovs were disappeared. Most just left Russia. And having this having communism in Russia was like a reset button in a way. Because as I just explained, Russia was falling apart with the Tsars and the other guys. Russia was doing terrible. It could have fallen apart. It could have been a massive threat for other countries. But by having communism, it was sort of a reset button. It just changed things, and maybe some empires thought this was a good option, and maybe that decision totally backfired, and we're still left with these secret decision-making bodies, and they can still make decisions that we're not supposed to know about. So this is kind of the heart and the soul of this book, because if we understand these things better, then we can make better decisions now regarding Russia or regarding an ideology, because you're always working with an imperfect historical record, or you're working with insufficient data. You have to guess a few things, you have to interpolate a few things. And I'm trying to be as objective as I possibly can. I'm not picking any scenario over the other because I like it, or because it sounds cooler, or because it, because it gives me a good feeling, right? It's just this is what's going on, and you better get it right, or you better understand how complicated it is. Because if you make a wrong assumption of the past, and then you create a historical argument, and then you base your strategy on that, if you're wrong about the past, your whole strategy is wrong, or maybe wrong, and you are just destroying your own opportunities, and you're causing the biggest problems you couldn't even imagine. So this is kind of the core essence of the book.
Yeah, and you summarized quite a bit of the book. I recognize many of the facts. And again, for those of you who are joining us, we're discussing Alexander Benesch's one of his books, The Stage Fall of the USSR and Its True Relationship with China. And I've learned quite a bit about this. Where I look at the global situation and internal politics in the United States and other countries is the competition of power centers. I think the approach you take is also correct too. I take a kind of like on a multiple choice exam, an all of the above approach that many different analysis has grains of truth in it. Where I start off, of course, is again competing power centers, and the ones that are threatening the West and the United States primarily are Russia and China and their allies in internationally, like Venezuela, North Korea, Cuba, South Africa, which is under the control of an ANC, South African Communist dominated government, Syria, Iran, and many other countries. And you have various extremist groups and radical groups of the so-called right and left that are aligned in some way or another with the strategic interests of Russia and China. And these include groups in the United States, various communist groups, some of the remaining neo fascist or neo Nazi groups, which I don't consider right or left, by the way, as well as various politicians, other institutional actors. Now, on the other side, and this is where I get into trouble with the more conservative and libertarian and Reagan Republican viewers and analysts, is in a way the National Socialists and the Communists were correct in viewing the West, and including the United States, as dominated by big capitalism. And there's much evidence, which I propound in my books, which basically reveal that, from declassified internal documents of the old Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact, defectors from the intelligence and military apparatus, even statements by multi-billionaire and multimillionaire business people in the United States and elsewhere. And there's a very important intelligence component in there. I'll never forget a story that our colleague and friend J.R. Nyquist related in several interviews, where he talked about how he was trying to promote his first book, Origins of the Fourth World War, and he tried to get it more popularized or wider exposure by conservatives, and he was working for World Daily and Newsmax at the time, and he was told by a political counselor of a very prominent billionaire at the time, who was an active funder of conservative causes, that no, we're not. Yes, I know, and I'm fishing buddies with Ladislav Bittman, who is the former head of the Czech disinformation department, who defected to the West in 1968. I said, yeah, I know the collapse. We know the collapses. Soviet Union was not real, but we can't get anywhere. We're not going to get the billionaires and millionaires to fund it for the most part, because they're investing in China and Russia. And if we had strategic missile defense, everything's going to be fine. So, and this has been Western policy for decades, since the inception of Bolshevism. And this is where, it's a long story, this is where I gradually realized over time that, and even beforehand through just a lot of academic research I've done, that the enemies in the West also are so-called monopoly capitalism or corporate capitalism.
And this,
it's not to say that they're not good actors or that I'm for socialization of the economy. And I think people get confused by that, because there's a commandment in American conservatism and British conservatism, which is very different from European conservatism, by the way, as many of you know already, and that is, thou shalt not criticize capitalism. Maybe you'll criticize a little bit because of the wokeism or this or that, but they don't criticize the power dynamics in the United States. And you mentioned something very interesting about the new serfdom, the serfdom to the private landowners in Tsarist Russia, as well as in the Middle Ages, before, of course, the serfs were freed in 1861. And to communism and working in communist industries and collective farms and state farms throughout the world, as well as also the National Socialists working for the landowners and peasants, who were in turn were very strictly controlled by the Reich food estate, or Reich Nachstand, and whatnot, which is basically, it was a form of socialism. There's very similar to today, where when you look at the business press, where you look at the critics of business, because of course it's not covered by conservatives, when people are working for Walmart or Elon Musk, Tesla, and others, you have this sort of privatized authoritarianism also in play. And what's fascinating to me is how you have individuals like Elon Musk, while they take a very reactionary, anti-labor, very callous and cruel policy of horrible working conditions reputedly in their factories, and this sense of bonded labor, because the capitalists will have more leverage over someone in the workplace as opposed to someone like me. There are power differentials, and this is where we have to take the criticisms of the left and incorporate it and be truth tellers, and really incorporate it and say,
right now,
how are we going to make capitalism better? how are we going to outflank the socialists, the communists? And this has been done in history. Bismarck, whatever our criticisms, did that side by side with his anti socialist laws. FDR, who I'm very critical of, and other areas did the same with the New Deal and everything else. So, this is where I come from. And piecing all of this evidence together, I look at several things. I look at power
Exactly.
dynamics, I look at
Um,
historical record, I look at the intelligence aspect, I look at also
an
human
actual
nature,
evil, right?
psychology.
It's
Yeah.
about having proper definitions, even scientific definitions about evil, right? Because
Mhm.
when you look at different religions, when you look at different political ideologies, they always promise that they and only they understand how evil works and how you can defeat it. But these concepts were even the ideologies, they were created before we had modern science about human evil, right? So it took I think it took until the 1980s when the medical literature started to incorporate research on malignant narcissism, right? And then we got new
Mhm.
scanning technology. So nowadays you have scientists like I think it was James Fallon, who looked at the brain scans of psychopaths, and he looked at the genetics of psychopaths, and he looked at other factors that go into that. So now we have an actual scientific understanding of extreme forms of human evil. And so we can then look back at history and try to use that modern science in figuring out, what was Hitler really like, what was Stalin like, what was Mao like, what were other uh, leaders and dictators really like. Was this just the pragmatism of the time, or was it outlandishly evil? Was it just pathologically evil? So once we have a scientific modern understanding of human evil, we can better make the distinction in terms of rulers and dictators of the past. And we can make that distinction. Was that person just pragmatic and dealt with the situation, and didn't have many options? Or was that person outlandishly evil, way over the top, especially in a fashion that even hurt that person's own interests? This is like the typical example of Hitler, right? Hitler was most likely very pathological. People always just talk about his ideology, but the probably the controlling aspect was a mixture of pathologies, and so he was so over the top in his in his decisions, and especially his the domestic killing program, right? And of course, when this was going on, and immediately afterwards, even seasoned generals who just looked at the war and the entire era, the entire Nazi era, many experts wondered why did they do that? Why did they try to kill every Jewish person instead of and why did they mistreat these populations in Poland and Ukraine, and why didn't they treat these people better and gave them opportunities so they would be there would be sort of a broader base against communism? Why was it so outlandishly evil? And of course, if you have modern science, you can answer these questions a lot better. And when we compare them, we draw these comparisons to outrageous capitalism. It's a psychopathic, narcissistic capitalism, right? This whole grab what you can, break every law, try to get away with everything. If it's really unregulated, if there's too much chaos, a system cannot really run for a long time. If it's too mafia, it's too primitive. These people will fight among each other way too much. I think, and how would the next generation function if they grow up with the craziness, and if they grow up with the wealth why would the next generation have a work ethic? Why would they take
Yeah,
risks for a group, for a collective purpose? Why wouldn't they just take drugs and drink and not really work and just command people
exactly.
around? Especially with
Exactly.
narcissism, the most defining feature of pathological narcissism is a detachment from reality. You don't see things the way they are. You just maintain a fantasy and cultivate that fantasy in your head the whole time, and you just
Right.
lie to yourself and to others to uphold that fantasy. Now, how successful can that be in the long term? We saw this with the Nazis. They were amateurs in many ways, made so many terrible choices, and then we see other empires that have existed for hundreds of years, and we see aristocratic families that were powerful for 1,000 years, like some of these European families. And so I think that especially these aristocrats, who became bigger and more powerful over the time, I think they developed a system of controlled greed where you enforce this loyalty within the family. You have a strong work ethic. You get them rewards. So if you take those risks, if you put in the work, you get specific exclusive rewards, but you're not
Right.
showered with these rewards, especially in your early life, because otherwise everybody just takes drugs and has a bunch of fun. You couldn't run a system for a prolonged time, and that's why I think that even American, the worst of American capitalism, I think there's something else behind it, because um, it can seem chaotic at times, but the way it expanded in the last, in the 1870s, especially 1880s and 1890s, when all that happened in America, I think there was a large degree of hidden control. I think there was a large degree of coordination, because it created the oil industry, the steel industry, then the car industry, which was all war empire related. And so I think it's naive to think that this stuff just happened and it was just about the personal greed of a Mr. Vanderbilt or Mr. Rockefeller. So I think it's the old problem that Professor Quigley talked about: secret centers of decision making. Who are they? What have they screwed up? And why is there no accountability whatsoever? And of course, because regular media and regular historians, they're not really looking into this. And so there's a vacuum. People want to know who's making the decisions, people want to know secret things. And so that's when controlled conspiracy media appeared, and conspiracy mythology tried to fill that vacuum and say, we're the experts, we know it all. But, I always, all the time, I get into these arguments on Twitter and X with these truthers, and I tell them, you guys have two buttons. One button is it's the Jews, and the other button is you're with the Jews. And that's
Right.
all you do. It's these two
Well,
buttons, and you press.
they accuse J.R. Nyquist of being a Jew. Literally, there are
Sure.
people on our Twitter pages that are agree with us on the nature of the threat of Russia and China, but they'll claim, oh, it's the Zionists, it's the Jews, and if you try to give a nuanced approach to the Jews, or like capitalism, it's the same problem, and you say, well, not all the Jews are, quote, bad Jews, which is, of course, the term you quoted Winston Churchill as saying in your book. It's not all capitalists are bad, that these problems are more nuanced, because when you look at Jewish people who are communists, I mean, to quote one of Stalin's, I think, aides, Lev Meklis, he said to Stalin, no, I'm not a Jew, I'm a communist. When
Yeah.
Trotsky said, the Jews interest me as less than Bulgarians,
Mm-hmm.
when, for example, the surviving rabbis issued protest notes to Trotsky and Lenin about the pogroms by the Red Army against the Jews, Trotsky would just consign them with the note for the archive. When Lenin himself, as published by Richard Pipes, the well known Harvard historian of the Soviet Union, where he has published declassified documents, one of which shows Lenin stating that the iron rod of repression should be applied against the Jews, not just the petty bourgeoisie. We'll say petty bourgeoisie to be polite, but we really mean the Jews. When you look at this, the early Bolsheviks were anti-Zionists. They were not friends of the Jews. And when you try to bring this up in subsequent data, they'll just bring you these quotes that I would argue are possibly either made up or exaggerated or taken out of context. You know, like this secret intelligence report by American military intelligence purportedly in the first few years of Bolshevik Russia saying, 70% of the Bolshevik leadership was comprised of Jews, but they don't look deeper. Now,
Yeah, but
concerning your
who
view on
are the Red Army
capitalism,
soldiers? Who are the Red Army soldiers actually carrying
well, there
out,
are
the
Russian peasants
violence?
and
This is
workers.
Russians. They're Russians.
And as you mentioned in your book, you touched upon this, and I've touched upon it in my research a little bit more as well. Is that the Cheka, the first secret police of Bolshevik Russia, as well as the Red Army, contained numerous Okhrana and Tsar Imperial
Oh yeah.
Army officers. Brusilov. I mean, you talk about the British intelligence. I mean, the British intelligence is one of the most oldest professional intelligences, but so is the Okhrana or
And
the
vicious,
Okrina
just
and the various iterations of
a vicious
and that
toolbox.
culture, the culture of the Okhrana was incorporated into Bolshevik Soviet intelligence. It wasn't. It was it was a new phenomenon, but the art of the agent provocateur, which you describe in your book too, as well, in some detail regarding the imperial czarist penetration of the Russian socialist movement. I mean, a lot of that culture and strategy of intelligence work was grafted into the communist intelligence services.
Yeah.
Now, when you talk about capitalism, we also can't underestimate also, and I know you don't, the power of ideas. And one of the things I agree with our friend and colleague, J.R. Nyquist, is the problem of the ethics and morals of leadership. And I think where this country took a wrong turn, both when it comes to antitrust, when it comes to regulation, when it comes to tax policy and trade policy, et cetera, is the proliferation of libertarian ideas. Because in many ways, I know most of the audience is going to get very angry with me here in America when they say this, but I would argue that libertarian ideas triumphed more than what they would like to admit. You have a lot of the repeals of Glass-Steagall, the periodization of antitrust.
And isn't it like fake? Isn't it like manipulative marketing? If people say,
well, it is.
This
it
thing
is.
in history, they say something was free market, but it was very controlled market, and it's just like deceptive labeling, and then they just start to make historical arguments, right? It's like when the British had these open colonies, and they would force them to hand over resources and then buy these industrial products back. This was sort of morphed into free market thingy-majingy, and then the British East India Company. I mean, to this day, what was the British East India Company? Was this a private enterprise? Was this government? Or was this sort of a hybrid of both? Or did these people just didn't care what you would call it because it was just about, gaining control? And they don't care what they call it, but we get so hung up with these terms and these political movements. And I mean, I've been running my own little company, my own entrepreneurship thing here for quite a while. So I know how nice it is to have the option, to have the very option to say, I don't want to work for some other company because I think they stink. I don't want some idiot being my superior, and I want to do this by myself. And so it's nice to have that option. And I understand that how important it is that I can I have the liberty to pick my own topics. I can publish a book. I can put out articles. I can put out a video. I don't have to ask anybody for permission, unless, of course, I say something that's outrageously illegal. So I understand how important freedom is. I do not want to live in a baseline tyranny. But what this libertarian movement has become over the years is quite strange to me because they part of this movement has become sort of a marketing front for
Yes,
criminal enterprises breaking every rule that we have a name for. So at some point, it's
exactly.
not about so it's like mislabeling. It's like deceptive marketing. It's not about libertarianism for some people. It's about shilling for these Vanderbilts of the past and these Rockefellers
Yes,
and
yes.
everybody who's even people who have been openly knowingly involved in the intelligence
See,
business, like the Rockefellers. With some of these libertarians, I mean, I have to ask them, are you really about liberty, or do you have a scientific full concept of liberty, how to get it, how to keep it? Do you really know about liberty, or are you just shilling for a group that is behaving like an aristocracy, that is playing by aristocratic rules? I really want to know. Can you be honest with me? And so we even have some weird brands of libertarianism in Europe. So these are people who are openly calling for the reinstatement of the aristocracy, of aristocratic rule, because they say this aristocracy would then be a transition phase on the long journey to freedom. I kid you not. So
yeah.
this is how you understand that aristocratic mindset that has crept in or bought its own way into the libertarian movement. So of course you have to ask yourself, what am I dealing with here? What are these people? What is really their concept of getting towards liberty and keep it?
Well, yeah, and I look, I am for a form of free enterprise too as well, and I think we have to make a differentiation. There are many different types of capitalists. There are small and medium-sized capitalists. You have the large corporations. I'm not, just for the record, I'm not for getting rid of big business or big banks or anything like that. However, they're like in a sports game, a soccer match, or a football game, American football game, or whatnot, there needs to be tightly enforced rules and regulations enforced by a leadership class. And as I was saying earlier, this is where I agree with our friend and colleague J.R. Nyquist. You need a leadership class that has a sense of morals and ethics that I think most Americans and most Europeans of goodwill and good nature could agree with. And I think where the libertarians or economists and philosophers and business people played a negative role is really quietly, almost a silent coup, really shifting the gears and the notion of how government should govern. And there was a libertarian economist, who's a native of Virginia, James Buchanan. He claimed that, quote, there is certainly no measurable concept that could be called the public interest. The public interest
Hmm.
in the politician's view does not exist. Buchanan made it his life career to, quote, tear down the very concept of the public interest. Now, to a European, that would sound terrible and awful because even European conservatives, particularly in Germany, as you know, you had the phenomenon of the social market economy. And frankly, if people want to say what system, at least in Europe, do I agree with the most, it's the social market economy. It's not libertarianism, it's not Thatcherism. In England, it's certainly not Erich Honecker of Walter Ulbricht's socialism or German National Socialism, while on the other side of the
Yeah.
perspective. And why do I do that? Well, for the national security minded people, there are several reasons. Number one, it makes capitalism look good. If you have capitalism that is balanced, that is humane, that is ironed out of its natural contradictions and irrationality, you have the stabilization of political and economic freedom. You have it looking good in the eyes of the younger generation. You have less excuses for people to be anti-capitalism because, of course, the reason why, while I'm very critical of a certain type of capitalism called neoliberalism, I also reject anti-capitalism because, frankly, bad things come with anti-capitalist revolutionary forms of dictatorship. We all know that here in Europe and America and elsewhere throughout the world. The other part is that there's the trade component, and of course, you touched upon it in your book. You've discussed it in various segments of your shows that you have on Candor Intelligence Network, and that is that the infusions of cash, loans, grants, trade, technology, and all the political legitimacy conferred upon these horrific socialist and communist and fascist dictatorships by trade, because big business has such a huge amount of control in free world politics, that creates an opening for subversion to influence these host governments in London and Washington, D.C., in Bonn, and elsewhere to make favorable accommodations with an East Germany, with the Soviet Union, with Putin's Russia, with communist China, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, you talk about earlier about Russian and Soviet addiction to Western technology. I was reminded, this is in a German language source, where Franz Josef Strauss, who was an anti-communist who mysteriously became the biggest and most staunchest advocate of Ostpolitik towards the former East Germany, the old DDR, and he commented to a fellow parliamentary Bundestag colleague at the time in the 1980s that the East Germans were addicted to the Deutsche Mark like a heroin addict. And of course, because there were so many sources, starting with the swing credits that the Deutsches Bundesbank started to disburse to the old GDR starting under agreement in 1949, and remittances and all kinds of grants and trades and co-production deals. For Franz Josef Strauss is right. And West German big business, particularly within the BDI, the German Employers Federation at the time, and Otto Wolf, Amarangen. Yeah,
an aristocrat, by the way. An
Who
aristocrat.
was an aristocrat, who was a member of the Trilateral Commission and the Bilderbergs, and you touch upon the Bilderbergs in the book that we're discussing on the fall of the USSR and its alliance with China. When I started to look at that, I started to look at the situation as it was. You have to think in terms strategically. In order to preserve something, you have to be a truth teller about a system's defects in order to improve it. And here in America, we're not doing that. We are not, and unfortunately, the conservatives, the libertarians, Republicans, most of them are very blind to this, because they'll view me as, Nevin, you're become a socialist, you're intellectually inconsistent. And I've gotten some pushback, and some of it kind of obnoxious and really devoid of facts. Kind of like what Jeff Nyquist on the trade and investment issues with Russia and China got that pushback to as well. But I think I've become much more of a stauncher critic of capitalism than most anti-communists here in the United States,
you have to
without trying to sabotage the system. So that's what kind of keeps me up at night. But I wanted to get back more to your book, and you mentioned quite a bit about fascinating information. A couple of key points that I mentioned to you is the Mao's long march from the assault by the Chinese Kuomintang, or nationalist forces. Mao's long march to the Yunnan province was actually funded by the Soviets. I know Mao received money from Moscow, and it was radio contact with the Soviet leadership during the 1930s and onwards, but I did not know his actual expedition, the Long March, was funded by the communists, by the Soviets. And also, you brought up a CIA document that was declassified, which talked about how China and North Korea was approaching China, I believe it was in the 1980s, with requests for militarily relevant Western technology that the Chinese received, which immediately talked about, despite the Sino-Soviet split in playing one communist country against another, which every major Western country did during the Cold War and even afterwards, that shows coordination within the bloc. True. North Korea, which also had very close ties with the Soviets, was now cooperating with China, purportedly tilting towards the United States, and in receipt of Western technology. And the research that you and I and Jared Nyquist and others have done shows that there was a lot of coordination despite these splits. And I uncover evidence every month, basically, where there's always this factual tidbit which shows that there's a lot of coordination in technology, military, intelligence, political alignment, etc. So, do you care to comment about and elaborate more in detail on the
Sure.
coordination between China, the Soviet Union, and now Russia? And what does that mean for today? So, take it
All
away.
right. So I think that eventually empires really learned from the past and they understood why empires in the past failed, because you can not only learn from somebody else's successes and just copying what they did, but you can also learn from somebody else's mistakes and then avoid that kind of thing that was done wrong. And I think that when you talk about these communist countries, I think what they really understood was the biggest flaw, or one of the biggest flaws of a traditional empire like the Roman Empire or the later European empires. And the flaw was that you know exactly where this particular empire starts and where it ends. You know exactly what the territory is, and it's very clearly defined. You know, this belongs to them. And the more transparency you have in an empire, this creates all sorts of problems. And this was, of course, Rome's problem. And this was also very much the problem of these later European empires, because you know these European empires were family based, so you would know France is controlled by this family mostly, and then you know Britain is controlled by those families, and Germany or German territories were controlled by those families. So the more transparency you have, the more somebody can attack you. They know what your resources are. They can spy on you to gain all sorts of information about you. So, what's the logical conclusion you can draw from that? You need obfuscation. You need obfuscation methods so people don't know how big your empire is. They don't really know where it starts. They don't really know where it ends. And they don't really know who's running it in what way. So when you look at these different communist entities, you know, the way they are presented, you know, Soviet Russia, then the Soviet Union, China, and then North Korea. I mean, it was, what other choice did they have but obfuscate, but play these games and say, or create the impression, we're just new at this, you know, we're morons, we're too greedy, we will fight among each other the first opportunity we get, and we're just squabbling and we're dumb and we're idiots, right? I mean, this is something you want to create, this false impression that other people underestimate you. They think you're new to the game. They think you're not really up to the task, you know, the challenge. But even you know, even when we look at Britain, even when we look at parts of the United States, I think there's a lot of obfuscation, right? Because we don't know what the British secret networks were on American soil, you know, before, during, and after the American Revolution. We don't know exactly what modern day Commonwealth is really like. You know, the British Commonwealth. They said, we're not doing the old imperialism anymore. We're not just pushing people around in these faraway countries and just shooting them if they misbehave. We're nice now. We're modern now. But, you know, what is it really? How much do they control this Commonwealth through intelligence methods? And so modern era is all about obfuscation. Nobody's supposed to know who makes these decisions, really. And same goes with communism. They would have... So they would have a new territory, like in Poland after World War II. They would gain a new piece of territory: Ukraine, Poland, East Germany. What did they do in this territory? Implemented complete control, like you would
Mhm.
expect. But then in Asia, we're supposed to believe they did it completely differently. You know, in Asia, all of a sudden, you have these free-roaming communist countries like China and North Korea, and they do their own brand of socialism, and they have a hereditary communist dynasty in North Korea and that sort of nonsense. So it's amazing that they could actually sell this obfuscation. It's amazing to me people would ever believe it. when we have a historical record, which I show in the book, about how Russia forced itself onto China, training these Chinese revolutionaries, running them, having them under surveillance, cleaning them politically every now and then, getting rid of anybody who was not really pro Moscow, and then just verbatim copying the Stalinist system for China down to a T, an exact copy of it. And it's like, some people wondered back then, why didn't they do it differently in China? Why not just try something nicer in China? Why would they destroy every enterprise in China? Why would they be so cruel in China? Well, somebody made the decision to copy the Russian Soviet system. So that's what they did. And so what I'm presenting in the book is a very plausible explanation, far more plausible than the standard view of history. Because the standard view is Russia would make this huge investment. Russia would bet so much on what would happen in China, but they would not. The Russians would not secure their investment. They would just help along the Chinese, and then the Chinese would completely do their own thing. I don't think so. I really don't think so. And if you watch, and what I show in the book, if you watch that theater played by the Chinese and the Soviets, it was based on mostly words. So they would stage these public meltdowns and tantrums. We hate you, and no, we hate you more. And this would filter through the apparatus in China and Russia, and it would eventually find its way to Western intelligence services. So Western intel was listening to the same kind of story from different sources. Oh, they hate each other over there. But this impression could be created with just words, empty words. And then they had this staged border crisis where they put some troops, a couple of 10,000 troops on either side of the border, and they would pretend it's hundreds of thousands of troops, and created this impression that Russia and China would go to war. They would just completely squash each other, and they did this theater throughout the 1960s, and then at the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s, that's when Henry Kissinger was able to convince President Nixon, okay, now is the opportunity. Now we have to play nice with the Chinese, so we can play the communists off against each other. We can play with the Chinese and then make demands from the Russians and blah, blah, blah. So, like, empty words, you're putting all that, you're taking that kind of risk for empty words, which the communists were using. Are you really sure? How difficult would it have been to stage that? Not very difficult at all.
Yeah, and something to knock your socks off. There's a very good website, and it contains some real gems for the Cold War International History Project at Princeton University. And to really peel away the layers of the onion on the Sino-Soviet split, there was a conversation, a transcript or a summary of a conversation between the former East German communist dictator Erich Honecker and North Korean former president dictator Kim Il-sung. And this is back in, I believe, 1984. And it confirmed the motivations behind China's so-called opening to the U.S. And in this summary of conversation between Honecker and Kim Il-sung, it stated that given the complex, this is Kim Il-sung saying this, who, by the way, had met both with Chinese and Soviet leaders from basically the inception of the DPRK, North Korea, all the way until to this present day, where Putin and Xi Jinping both occasionally will meet, including recently with now Kim Jong-un. So Kim Il-sung says, given the complex world situation, I hope that the Soviet Union and China work things out. I believe that the development of relations, this is where a key sentence starts, I believe that the development of relations with the US is not targeted against the Soviet Union. Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai already told me that when they established relations with the US. They told us every time they met with Japan and the US, the only objective of these relations is to obtain developed technology and credit from Japan and the US.
Sure.
And we got more. Joseph, in the wake of Yugoslav dictator Josip Broz Tito's visit in 1977, Chinese Foreign Minister Huang Hua admitted that while, quote, minor differences exist between our two nations, we still have a common goal. We do this to achieve our objectives. What is the common goal? Global communist totalitarianism. In a 1987 conversation with Deng Xiaoping, the great, the reformer, the capitalist, the one that Ronald Reagan said that China in a visit in 1984, oh, China is no longer a communist country. In a
Mm-hmm.
1987 conversation with Deng Xiaoping, Bulgarian communist ruler Todor Zhivkov asserted that China and Bulgaria, quote, shared common aims and ideals. In another meeting, Deng Xiaoping claimed that Bulgaria and China share a common aim. We must make efforts together. Now, getting to the sort of staged acrimony when you were talking about that, that made me think of some historical evidence from our friend Anatoly Golitsyn. And Golitsyn personally witnessed this. This is very interesting from his book, New Lies for Old. Golitsyn reported that the Soviets specifically instructed the Yugoslavs not to sign the Moscow Declaration of 1960. Now, why is that important? Because that's where there were signs of fractures between Yugoslavia, China, and the Soviet Union. During a lecture, General Kurenkov told KGB officers, including Golitsyn, who was present, that while the Yugoslavs agreed with the 1960 declaration, it was determined that a public signature was not in the best interest of the long-range strategy of both countries. According to the conversations between Colonel Grigorenko and Golitsyn, Moscow delegated the job of winning neutral and anti-US third world countries, Western socialists, and trade unions to Yugoslavia. Belgrade's non-aligned image would greatly assist communist penetration of the Western left and the third world. According to Colonel Grigorenko, the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia would feign various spats to continue the charade of occasional acrimony between Moscow and Beijing and Belgrade. And this was confirmed by by Yugoslav communist defectors too, like Bogdan Radica, who was a former assistant to Tito, who also defected to the West. I'm not going to read all that, but that was confirmed by Bogdan Radica and his sources back in Yugoslavia. So when we look at the whole situation here, splits in the communist world, and including today between Vietnam and China, I would argue are at best vastly exaggerated. And in the case of Yugoslavia and Romania, back during the Cold War, was actually feigned and
Mm-hmm.
completely staged. When you look at Romania, before we go down, not only do you have the revelations of General Ion Pacepa in his book Red Horizons, which shows that the split was fake, I would argue, but also the Cold War International History Project of Princeton University also has documents from the old Romanian Communist Party, which talked about how the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Romania by the mid 1960s was a strategic form of disinformation to show that Romania was independent, that Romania was not dependent on Soviet troops, and it was to basically take away a Western NATO propaganda advantage that, oh, just all the Warsaw Pact countries were in power only because of the presence of Soviet troops. So when you really dig into this and you look at primary sources, you look at media reports, defector information, the things I'm reading, it kind of confirms one thing. Never, ever, 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 ever trust a communist dictatorship or form of totalitarian government. And fake splits have occurred even in the Islamic world too,
Oh
as
yeah.
well. That also people have talked about, like splits with Hamas and the PLO, splits within the PLO, the PLO supposedly becoming moderate. No, it's
Obfuscation,
because
yeah. Yeah.
exactly,
And I think that
never, ever, ever trust these people,
I think
ever.
that I think that some people in the West, officials and whatnot, some people in the West, they were genuinely deceived, right? They just got this intel from 20 different directions, and then they thought this was the actual picture. But then, of course, there's a level above that, a level above these people in the West, and on this higher level, these officials probably, they thought something different. They probably thought that, yeah, of course we know they're fooling us over there. Of course we know they're playing theater over there, but we're working on some kind of a deal with them, because that we think will bring stability. But we can't really talk about this in public. We cannot really tell anybody else about that, because then we might not get the deal, and because that deal would be pretty scary in many ways. And then there may be another higher level above that, where people in the West even know more than that, and they will say, yeah, sure, they have infiltrated us so badly. The communists, they have penetrated us so bad with their spies. We must make a deal with them, but it's such a horrible deal overall that we cannot ever talk about this in public, so it must be absolutely secret. And of course, as I run the scenarios in the book, there may be an even higher level above that says, yeah, sure, we already have a deal with the communists. We've had it for a long time. It's all under control. That's a possibility, but you always have to think in layers. Not everybody in the West knows the same stuff or is keyed in, or there may be significant differences in perception and what they're thinking about, because it's I don't believe that you can fool everybody in the West, right? If you fool these, or try to fool these experienced people in the West, they would laugh at you. They would laugh at your attempt, because some of these Western people, they know how this works. They've done it themselves. They ran the deceptions against the Germans, with Winston Churchill and that kind of stuff. So they know how obfuscation works. They've done it themselves. They know how theater works. They would laugh at this attempt, right? But we're supposed to believe that Western officials are simply pragmatic and naive in a way. And some of them may be, but I don't think a lot of them are, or I don't think many of them are not. And so it's like some people go along with the theater. They say, yeah, we know they're playing theater, but we have to go along because we want to get a deal, or we already have a deal, or we must make a deal. And it's such a bad deal for most people that this can never reach the public eye, and has to remain secret. And when I talk about some of these very old families, families that have been around for 1,000 years and they're very successful, they know how to keep secrets, and they know how to trust each other. I mean, if you vet your relatives, if you vet them continuously for 1,000 years, I mean, you can trust them, right? I mean, you can really trust them, and this offers possibilities that other groups don't have, because regular groups, regular intelligence networks, they have to vet each other, of course, but they can't do it in the same way. So when it comes to communism and the ongoing structure of the West, what are the secret, or maybe secret decision-making powers here? I think we do have to look at the actual toolbox of power, the full toolbox, and we also have to look at some of these older families, because it's not been researched right. It's not been properly researched how many of these old intelligence networks are still around, especially when America became independent. The British stopped their military action, but the British probably tried to continue the intelligence war indefinitely, and we don't know what their networks were on American soil, how they were expanded. I mean, I'm looking at Skull and Bones, for example. I think it's a British network originally, so there's a whole section of history that we haven't even looked at properly, and so then when you see groups like Skull and Bones being especially involved in America in selling stuff to the Soviets, you may want to look into this a lot deeper, because you're going to find some very old families, and most people, they've never even heard of these families because they think it's old history and it's done and over with. But, some families are done and over because they fought each other in the past, and most of them lost the battle. But if you look really hard in Europe's history, you will find this triple cluster of families in the historical record, right? Welfs, Wettins, and Reginars. And they were very, very successful, and they most likely had significant intelligence capabilities, and they probably had networks on American soil. And it's probably Skull and Bones and some others. And you talked about, this capitalism, this out of control so-called capitalism. You talked about this a few minutes ago, and I don't think we know the true history or the full history of many large corporations, because in Europe we had this outrageous, or internationally we had this silly construct of the British East India Company, and then we had some other aristocrats from the same group, and they fronted the money for a new corporation, and they controlled the universities, so they had the scientists on hand and the patents on hand. And when you also have intelligence networks, you can actually create a front company that looks legit, looks very much like a private enterprise. So if that's been going on, how much do we actually understand about the true history of many corporations? Is this what we think it is? And how does a more professional view, what does that tell us about the ideologies? I mean, how much ideological stuff we take for granted, from libertarians or leftists or conservatives, right? Because if we don't know the actual history of capitalism, how can we make certain baseline assumptions? How can we tell each other what to do, right? And
Right.
what to excuse, because we're expected to make a lot of excuses. Oh, let this company do this thing. Don't look into this company, because we don't want communism. So just let them do their thing. Well, what if there's too much of a centralization of power, and what if you get a mega mole, like a Lord Louis Mountbatten or something like that, or somebody who runs an entire industry? What if there's a centralization, and it brings with it the increased danger of infiltration? Because if you get a mole in a certain position, that's of course horrendous. And so, you can't just make excuses all the time for corporations and the circles they may be entangled in. And it's like most people don't want to do the work of reconstructing, history, especially secret history. They use this two-bit activism, like conspiracy activism, or they use a left-wing explanation for everything. So they say, we know everything. We can explain everything in history through class warfare, because we've come up with this gimmick, right? It's always classes against each other, so we can explain all of history, we can predict the future, and we can answer every question. We have a solution for every problem. But I say, no, it's just a gimmick. It's an oversimplified gimmick that does not correspond with reality, and other people have tried other gimmicks. The Nazis, they have tried to explain everything through race. So we can just explain everything and solve every problem through a race-based view. But then if you look at history, the Nazis were terrible at intelligence, especially foreign intelligence, complete amateurs. They had problems with industry and production, and it was, the Nazi system was run by extremely pathological people, not just pragmatism, oh, we have to do this and we have to do that to compete. No, it was over-the-top pathological. It was over-the-top pathological evil. And so people make historical arguments, and they're not qualified to do so. And if you make certain mistakes, I mean, you see this all the time here in Germany, when the right wing, they base everything on fascist ideology, and they base everything on conspiracy ideology. And then they say, well, according to our view of history, we must now align ourselves with the Putin regime in Russia, and that's going to give us what we want. But if you really run that scenario in your head, we would come under Russian oppression. They would not just take us over and possibly destroy German culture. but they would also limit our numbers, and they would migrate other people here so that no single population group is too strong. So you would end up with the exact opposite of what you wanted. You know, you wanted this big independent German empire and have it all be white people, and we all look like the old propaganda posters, but then you end up with the exact opposite. So there's a lot of people who are completely unqualified, and I noticed that recently on Twitter or X that people are now even using basic terminology wrong. It's not just creating some fancy, lie or creating some distortion and making an effort in deceiving people or whatever. It's just about, somebody said that the Ukrainian demands, the Ukrainian demands in the war mean a surrender of the Russians. And I'm thinking that's not surrender. That's just withdrawing. The Russians withdrawing. They were withdrawing from Afghanistan once. They withdrew from East Germany once. They withdrew from Ukraine once. They withdrew from Poland once. And this was not a Russian surrender to these other countries. It was just a withdrawal. So people are using terminology wrong. And it's like a breakdown of communication itself. People don't read books. They are incapable of understanding what their limitations are. They're using terminology wrong, and they're using this two-bit activism, like saying, well, it's the Jews and you're with the Jews, or it's all class warfare. This is a breakdown of communication, and normally when communication breaks down, people look at other forms of forcing your will onto other people, and it's usually violence, and that's not a good thing at all.
Yeah,
So
there's
people need to appreciate how difficult this stuff can be, but it's still understandable because this is my job, this is your job. We're doing a lot of the work, specific work, so people out there don't have to replicate that. They don't have to do the same volume and do this full time and whatnot. So they can save time, and they can prevent mistakes. They can prevent themselves from making mistakes. This is kind of the job we do. This is the service we provide. It's like when you have a car accident, you don't have to operate on yourself, or you don't, or a relative of of yourself. A relative doesn't have to operate on you. You're getting this done by a trained professional. So you don't need a medical degree. You don't need to get a medical degree to get medical attention and medical help. You just let a professional do it. So this is
and a
what
word
these books are
about
for.
your mention about the, I would argue, strategic withdrawals, like the strategic withdrawal of Soviet troops from East Germany or Afghanistan, for example. It reminded me of something very important that Lenin wrote in Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. And that's something that all anti-communists really should read. It's publicly available on Marxist.org, the Marxist Internet Archive. And he said that political leaders of the revolutionary class are absolutely useless if they are incapable of, quote, changing tack or offering conciliation and compromise in order to take evasive action in a patently disadvantageous battle. He also stated that the strictest loyalty to the ideas of communism must be combined with the ability to make all of the necessary practical compromises, to tack, to make agreements, zigzags, retreats, and so on, in order to accelerate the coming into power. And I think that really talks about and speaks to the communist strategy today. It's let's withdraw the troops. Why? Because, like in the business world, they take the view of the SWOT: strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats to the system. And they would gain tremendous advantages if they make the effort to, okay, we're going to withdraw troops. We're going to sign this arms control deal, even though we're going to violate it and lie to the United States and the West while doing it and continue to build up our nuclear arsenal. We're going to do these sort of reforms, some cosmetic, some even somewhat deep reforms. Why? Because the strategic advantages that they will get is tremendous political legitimacy and international legitimacy. They're going to get trade, they're going to get technology. Now, sometimes the Soviet strategy failed, like in East Germany, for example. Erich Honecker was deposed by Egon Krenz and the Soviet leadership, and I believe even Erich Mielke and others deposed him, basically. Honecker was viewed as a liability to communism. They wanted to give communism a fresh face. So by putting Egon Krenz, who was at this time in his, I believe, his 50s, it would create a little Gorbachev. Really, the party's monopoly and basic mission of communist expansion would not be challenged, but it would be a fresher face. That failed. Then they had to go to Plan B, which is create a neutralized, socialized, united German Federal Republic. But that fell through too as well. And the events lead up today, where yes, the German Federal Republic is non-communist, but starting in the 1990s and really accelerating in the 2000s, the Russians figure out other ways, including time and true time-tested methods to penetrate Germany and to have more influence than I think many people would care to admit. So sometimes these controlled retreats and zigzags are failures, but in many other respects, they have been very successful and have constituted Russian victories. And I know you touch upon this a little bit in your book and as well. And again, what does this mean today? Well, people say, well, this is ancient history. And I would say that's not the case, because I think your book and the works that Jared Nyquist, Trevor Loudon, you, I, Jean Rabin, and others are doing are very valid, because since Obama, we've been told that, Vietnam, we can play the Vietnam card against China, or like Steve Bannon and others within elements of the MAGA crowd and the Republican Party, we can split Russia and China off from each other. That's something that a fellow who's been on my program, I like him personally, but I have profound disagreements with him on the nature of Russia. David Pine and others, and Steve Bannon and others, have argued that, we can split Russia and China apart from each other, that Russia and China are really having tensions and they don't have a lot in common, and Russia's scared of Chinese expansionism in the Far East. And when I listen to these arguments, I just scratch my head and I say, this is what they want us to hear. They want to feign disunity in order to achieve larger strategic goals. Our dream is to have these countries split apart. We don't want to admit to ourselves that, hey, that there is an extremely powerful threat out there that could potentially cause major problems, even the downfall of the United States and the Western powers. And, and I think there are larger issues that you point out to as well. There's an intelligence component. There's a lot of secret history that we don't know. After reading your book and after doing the research that I've done for years, I've really concluded about everything, whether it's the history of capitalism or socialism or communism, the history of ideologies, the history of corporations, the history of political movements. It's like an onion. There are many different layers to it. And I think that's where we come to the conclusion. And I think your book is more relevant than ever today, because the concept of exaggerated splits and differences, or even fake splits and differences, again, it's an ongoing issue. Again, Steve Bannon and others, David Pine and others saying, let's split Russia from China.
If you live in a system where you just get overtaxed, if somebody is taking your money, right? People are taking your money left and right, and you pay stupid prices for things. If that's kind of the case, if you can't really build wealth, if you can't keep your money, if you can't make good money with solid work, if you can't have built multi-generational wealth, if you can't really create your own little dynasty, right, where you have a strong family and everybody likes each other and they help each other, If that's not happening for you, if this is outside of your control, if you don't have these good things available, achievable, then you are being scammed. And it doesn't matter what the system you live under is called or how it's marketed or what gimmick they use to explain everything. You are being scammed. And especially if you don't have any real personal security, if you can be taken out at any moment, or somebody in your family or your friends, they can be ruined at any moment by someone or by, the authorities or whatever. If you encounter these circumstances, you are being scammed. And then you have to be systematic about it. Who is scamming me exactly? How are they doing it? And what am I supposed to do about it? And don't fall for these controlled opposition gimmicks, because that's just an easy way of keeping things the way they are. You have to be methodical about that. You have to be honest about that. You can't just pick something and say, well, I like this idea, so it must be true. And I don't like this idea, so it must be fake. And let's just figure this out, just combined, no matter where you come from or what your background is and what you've experienced in life and stuff that you've read. Let's just figure this out together and be constructive about it and very productive about it. It's not like you're not supposed to choose between different variations of the same scam. And activism is not the same, or real activism should not be endless, useless, unproductive fights. Just ineffective, incompetent complaining about everything. Just you complain about this group and that group, and you complain about women, you complain about men, you complain about people who have more than you. That's not how it works. It's just the exact opposite of how you get what you want. Because, some people assume, or many people assume, that empires are still stupid and function like they did in medieval times, and they haven't progressed since medieval times. But they really have progressed. They have scientists working for them that tell them how to improve things. So you're dealing with some very smart people, but their toolbox is still limited, and they also make mistakes. And they when you reach, and this is kind of what helped me all these years in my research, when somebody tries an operation that is just very, very big, it becomes not really possible to hide this operation because of all the metadata and the results of the operation. You can't really fully hide it because it's too big, but you can sort of draw attention away. You just have to create diversions. And once you learn how to get past the diversions, you can reconstruct some pretty large operations and networks, because as the empires grew, so did their operation, even though the toolbox is virtually the same. Or has remained the same. They now can have computer calculate things and test different options and operations before actually implementing them. So if you pick a standard ideology and you pick a standard way of thinking, they can calculate you. They can calculate what you're going to do. If they introduce that tax, or introduce another war, introduce something you don't like, they know in advance how you're going to react and how your fellow human beings are going to react. So this is kind of the only really new thing that they have, but it's still based on people's behavior. So I think I'm out of my time. I'm at the end of my time slot. I think you're at the end of your time slot.
Yes, yes, yes.
So yeah, this is just, people can check out my books. It's candorintel.com, and they can also look at Amazon and look for Alexander Benesch, my name, and look for the print books and the Kindle books, and they can also find your stuff on there as well. And if you read, you can be successful out there. If you don't read, you're gonna lose. This is kind of the constant thing that I've experienced over the years. It's really a question of winning versus losing if you read versus you don't read. So I suggest everybody out there starts reading.
And there's always new information that we're all coming across that will help us revise our conclusions, our analysis, because again, this whole study of history of intelligence, really it's like an onion with many layers to be peeled. I think that's probably the best way I could end this discussion. I think your book, The Downfall of the USSR and Its Alliance with China, which is an excellent book, which has taught me quite a bit, particularly about aspects of British history, British intelligence, British politics, some of which I was not familiar. Particularly, one of the standout parts of the book was the involvement of Lord Louis Mountbatten, who I thought was an anti-communist, and I had come across years ago press news articles talking about how the IRA killed him, allegedly at the behest of the Soviets, because the IRA was backed by the Soviets and their allies. And really, when I'm coming across all of this new information, again in the book, The Stage Fall of the USSR and Its True Relationship with China by my, I guess I could say, guest or host or co-host, Alex Benesch. A lot of rich resources that really should give the reader a lot of pause when looking at global events and European politics, particularly in Britain. Alex, thank you so much for the conversation. Definitely would like to have more with you in the future. And again, people can find Alex's works on Amazon.com. He also has the YouTube channel and his show, Candor Intelligence Network. He also has a show with Jaron Eichquist, Friends and Enemies, which is packed with tons of information and great conversation. So I highly recommend that too. Thank you again. Everyone, be safe. God bless.
Take care.
And take care.